G'day, I'm James Baldwin, and welcome to another episode of Lakeside Drive's F1 podcast. In this episode, we chat with Richard Saxby. Richard is McLaren Applied's head of Motorsport Accounts. He has a total of 10 Constructors World Championships under his belt, has worked with drivers such as Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, David Coulthard, Nico Rosberg, Romain Grosjean, Valtteri Bottas, Mark Webber, and many, many more. With so many stories to share from his time in the Formula One paddock over the last 22 years, I can tell you that it was a real pleasure to catch up with Richard, and I know that you'll love his stories. So let's get into it. Well, Richard, you come to us with an enormous amount of Formula One knowledge, experience, passion, and Constructors Championships. 10 in whole, including last year. An incredible feat, a resume that pretty much everyone in the paddock, I'm sure, would be very, very envious of. But more importantly, you're holidaying in the correct part of the world. You're in Australia at the moment. It's so great to chat to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, and thanks for that intro. I guess, when you put it into perspective, it is a great achievement for a lot of people, not just myself. But yeah, I'm in Australia. My father's Australian, and a lot of my friends who are here on the Gold Coast. So I come over to see those. I'm pretty much here. When I was racing, when I was trackside, it was twice a year. I'd come over for the Grand Prix, spend a week here, and then fly up to Malaysia. And then come back in October and come and see the folks and all my friends again here. Oh, and then I used to do the Indy and surfers a lot, because a lot of my friends who were racing V8s also had a lot of friends racing in kart at the time. So Will Power was a good buddy of mine.
Wow.
Back in the day, and he was racing kart, and then of course we had Davisons and Courtneys in the V8, so it was a good catch-up weekend.
Goodness me.
Very
yes,
good
well,
catch-up weekend.
That is very exciting, and glad that we can call you an Australian, at least from the dad's side by birth. Happy to do that. We on the podcast, we cling to Valtteri Bottas is an Australian because he's dating Tiffany Cromwell. So happy to do that. Well, Richard, let's go back to your beginning, shall we? Talk to us about your early life leading into motorsport. Where did you grow up, and what did you study?
So I grew up in the north of England, and then my father was an engineer, and it took him down south. So I ended up coming right the way down south from Yorkshire, right the way down to Kent. And I'd always had an interest in motorsports. My father, being an engineer, he always had an interest in anything that moved, turned, and we moved fairly close to Brands Hatch. And, when the weekend was okay and the weather was good, Dad would take me up to Brands. And I think that's what started my sort of love affair for race cars. Although I never considered myself to really want to get into the driving side of things. And I guess it was never encouraged, because it's still, even back then, it was always considered an expensive sport. But I was never particularly any good at driving, I don't think, even in my sort of late teens. So I'm lucky I didn't go down that path. But I started getting into the radio control cars, I think Lewis does that a bit as well. So I started getting into a bit of that, and I started learning about setup, and I started learning about camber and tire changes and tires and all that sort of stuff. And it was cool. It was cool. And but the sort of I used to sit there on the TV and watch the pit lane and think, well, how do these guys get into this pit lane? How do they get there? At the time there wasn't much, there certainly wasn't internet or anything like that. And you couldn't do any research, and it certainly wasn't as easy as it. I'm not saying it's easy to get in there, but it certainly wasn't easy to research. So I went to university, again in Canterbury, in Kent. And I sort of moved away from the mechanical side of things and sort of got into electronics. And this was about 1996, 95, 96. And the digital age was just beginning. We had Windows 95 and everything was kicking off. Well, exactly. You had all that. You had digital mobiles. I mean, before that, there was analog mobiles, right? So I ended up doing digital electronics, with a bit of medical science on the side, because I wanted to get into what's called sensors and monitoring and all that sort of stuff. And the digital age was dawning, so I never for once thought I'd put that to the automotive industry. But I did that degree and did 4 years of that, and it was great fun. And at the end of it, I was looking to sort of go into the medical industry using all this electronics and systems to monitor athletes, right? So you imagine you're an athlete, you're on the running machine and you get stuff stuck all over you, and you'd measure your flow rate, you'd measure your heartbeat, you'd measure your lung capacity, you'd have a mask on, it's just like something out of, Gattaca, and they're running on the old thing there. And so I sort of was expecting to go into that field. And what came along though was I was reading Autosport one weekend, and they had a jobs page back then. They had a jobs page, and in there it said sort of junior engineer. Please write to us with your CV. So I thought, well, give it a go. And I wrote to her. I wrote to a lovely lady called Kerry, and she was excellent. And she said, look, she wrote back to me, and I got this letter headed from Stewart Grand Prix.
Oh.
And I was sort of umming and ahhing about jobs. I think I was doing interviews at Sony Music as well then, for some weird reason.
Wow.
Yeah, that was cool. That was about making outside broadcast vehicles. So I'd sort of diversified away from maybe medical electronics then, because it was such a small field, and you sort of, just spread your wings. And this lady said, look, we don't have the junior engineer position available for you, but we do have a graduate R&D engineer available position. Would you like to come and interview for it? And I did. Went up to Milton Keynes, Stewart Grand Prix, interviewed by a guy called Malcolm Tierney. And before it even really got back in the car, I think I had a Nokia banana phone rang, and I felt like Matrix. And sure enough, Kerry said, "Would you mind coming back in?" And I went, "Yeah. Where are you?" "I'm just outside." So I walked back in, and they sort of offered me position of a junior R&D engineer. And really, that time the companies didn't really have much R&D. I mean, it was just myself, this other guy called Carl Willoughby, and an ex-mechanic called Simon Adams, who's still there. He's been there for like 30 years. But and that was the R&D department. And basically what we had to do was, so people ask me, well, how did I get the job? Well, I did this thing where I said, I think a Formula One car is like an athlete on a running machine, right? So it measures loads, it measures pressure, it measures flow rates. It measures, it's got a heart, the engine. It's got a brain, the ECU, and it's got extremities like suspension. It's got and of course I was doing all these analogies, not thinking that I was going to go anywhere with it, and they really saw a relationship with what I was doing to what the car needed to determine where the performance was required, right? So, that's how I got the job there, I think.
So would you say that you were part of that technical computer revolution of the sport, which maybe ruined it from what it used to be, where it was more mechanical setups to the computer side of it, which we love because it does obviously makes the cars 10 times faster than what they were. But
well, funny enough, later on in my career, that all went out the window. But I think I were. We had to determine. We had to sort of figure out what sensors we needed to determine where the performance was in the car. So there was all sorts of sensors you'd sort of stick over the car, and then have to harness looms to them, and then figure out what sort of logging rate you needed, that's how it was. And as technology moved on, sensors become much more advanced. They become wireless, or they became infrared, and you could look at tires as they were moving around and figure out what sort of temperature they were doing. And then it moved on again to internal pressure of tires and all this other stuff. We even started monitoring the driver. We put accelerometers inside their earpieces, so they knew when they were when they had a hard when they had a hard shunt, in the Bazzers. Then there was all sorts of other things like Formula One Marshall system came along, which is what you see, with the marshalling system now. So you've got quite a bit of a revolution back then. It was 99. So 2000 it became, so Jaguar Ford bought from Stewart Grand Prix, and we became Jaguar, and that was pretty crap. I think I spoke to Jackie Stewart about 2 years ago at the Silverstone Classic, and I said to him, yeah, this, that, and the other. He goes, yeah, Jesus Christ, what a load of crap that ended up being, didn't it? So Jaguar, unfortunately, was it was sort of siloed. And I think we struggled to ask for external help because you had to use Ford, right? And these guys wouldn't even know what a Formula One car looked like. And I think I can even quote, I think one of the Edsel Ford III or whatever he was, he just asked, who the hell is this Eddie Irvine? Because he was the second highest paid man in Ford, right? And they didn't know. They didn't know what it was all about. Anyway, we went through numerous, loads and loads of, MDs and technical directors, from Gary Anderson to Steve Nicholson to all these sort of, pretty respected people, but they were never able to pull the ship together. And consequently, we had really good drivers like Mark Webber. I'll put my neck out. And I've known Mark. We were on nodding terms technically, but yeah, he's a really nice guy. He came along and he really wrung the potential out of that last couple of cars that we had, really right on the limit. And and it got a couple of, I think it got a couple of decent laps. I think it split the Ferraris in Malaysia once in 2004, maybe.
Pole positions.
I don't think we had pole. Did we get pole? I don't think. No, definitely not. Yeah,
didn't he shit the bed on a start on the front row? It might not have been pole. It might have been second.
I think he was second. He split the Ferraris.
Yeah,
I think he was on the front row.
Yep.
But yeah, went backwards. It's just but then, of course, Red Bull came along, and.
So this is an interesting part for me, Richard, because I think you've gone from Stewart Grand Prix, which, as I said, Jackie Stewart, absolute mega name of the sport, to Ford buying them out under the Jaguar banner. I mean, Jaguar had a version of success compared to Stewart, it has to be fair, although maybe with the shift, the technological shift, that was just likely to happen anyway. But I just want to go back a little bit before we go into Red Bull, because I'm interested to know what it was like for you as a graduate engineer in your first race weekend. Can you remember what you felt like, what the vibe was in the team, how you were accepted, and what you sort of did for your first Grand Prix?
Yeah, I can actually. I went to my first Grand Prix because this is an interesting reason of why I ended up going to my first Grand Prix. So there was 2 race engineers. And there was 2 performance engineers, or like junior race engineers, that would just basically run out of the pit wall with some paper with some download figures on, really. And they would sit there crunching data. And both of those guys basically left at the same time, like upped and left, and didn't even go to the race, didn't even turn up.
Wow.
And we don't know why. Still this day, we don't know why. There was obviously some sort of internal politics. And of course, they'd phoned around all the departments, and these teams weren't as big as what you have now. I mean, you're talking about less than 200 people. And they said, right, Rich, go and grab a laptop from IT and get yourself out there. And we went to, I think we did, first race was Nürburgring. I think we did a Lurcy-Levis straight line test beforehand to sort of get me used to what was going on, with the engineer called Simon Smart. He was a great bloke. He taught me a lot. And I think I was actually called Mustard. I think it was either because you like me or you hate me, or I was keen. So
yes, there you go.
Yeah, so that's probably a better.
Now who was the chief mechanic at the time? I mean, there was a couple of characters, Darren was chief mechanic at the time, and crikey, names. But who was driving for us? Who was doing the straight line then? I think it was Della Rosso, I think, was the first. I think he was doing a straight line test. But anyway, yeah, there was a couple of drops. We went through quite a few drivers back then. But yeah, I remember it, and I remember the garage door lifting up and seeing the red line that said pit lane. And then remembering that thing that I said to you earlier is, how do those people get into the garage? How do those people get into pit lane? And that'll always stay with me. That'll always stay with me. And literally, I wanted to be there in the morning when the garage doors went up for some weird reason, some sort of, and I did it, and I remember seeing it, and that followed me all the way through my career, and sort of I didn't always stay on the race team at Jaguar. I'd end up going back into the factory when they got some decent people, certainly better than myself. And this was a team in a bit of disarray. Jaguar was in a bit of a disarray, and there was lots of changes in engineering, lots of changes, like I said to you before, in managing directorship and technical directorship. There was lots of infighting around aero, what should be in the aero map, what shouldn't be in the aero map. We had some people from Ford who took the wrong direction on the suspension, and there was just so many different things going on. There wasn't the reliability. We talked earlier before the podcast started about JC, James Courtney, Australian test driver. He suffered a big shunt at Monza, and I was there, and there was something that failed. And at Lesmos 1 and 2, he took a big 29G, maybe 25G, something like that. It was big enough to knock out his left hand side. I think it was his left-hand side of his body that wouldn't necessarily work properly. So there was things like that. You could sort of see Jaguar was in a bit of a disarray, and there were three silos with Jaguar. There was Jaguar Racing, there was Prix Electronics, and there was Cosworth, and they were all from the same company, right? They all formed this Premier Performance Group, which was all under the Ford banner. But they were treated like completely separate companies. So there was never that intended join up, right? You look at Mercedes now, Mercedes AMG and HPP, it is so seamless. Even though like 30, 40 miles away from each other, they are so well integrated. And you need to and Ferrari, of course, they're very well integrated. But at Jaguar, there's just us and them. And then there was a third party involved with Jaguar, because there was this Prix Electronics group who'd make all the electronics and so on and so forth. Very similar to what McLaren Applied are now. So yeah, that's where we're at with Jaguar. I mean, I was, strange enough, I was always there for some big shunts. The last test I ever did was Pascal. No, not. Crikey! You have to come up with a test driver. He was rubbish.
Plenty of those around.
No. No, I don't think he ever raced. I don't think he ever tested for us. He was Dutch fella. I think he won Formula 3000 actually. Anyway, first lap, we kept telling him about brakes. We kept on telling him about tyres. It was a bit damp. And he exited the last corner coming down the main straight at Silverstone and went straight into the wall and literally rolled the car over 2 or 3 times. And I was the first one. I think BAR were testing at the time, and I was the first one over the pit wall. And I ran to him. And I actually didn't give a crap about the driver. All I wanted to do was make sure he didn't throw the steering wheel out the car. Because the reason why I was at the test, is because we were testing a new steering wheel. Oh, yeah. And the first thing I did was like, hand me the wheel, mate. That's it. Hand me the wheel. Not try to get him out.
Did you walk off with the wheel in your hand? Well, look, let's hope that you're not the bad luck omen for crashes, hey?
Is there
well, I did have a good sniff around, see if there was any petrol, but I couldn't smell anything, so he was all right.
Is there a sense that you guys, the designers and the engineers, is there a sense that they are your cars and not the drivers? The drivers just pilot them, but you have the ownership of them ultimately?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And you can see that on the faces of firstly, there is obviously a human element to, is the driver okay? Of course there is.
Yeah.
But then the realization that you're going to do an all-nighter soon kicks in, and and then you're like, bugger. And then you think, crap. And then whether or not we've got the spares, the parts, whether or not the factory can get the stuff out to us, all this sort of stuff starts going through an engineer and mechanic's head. What have we lost in terms of prime parts or experimental parts that we needed to put mileage on? There's so many people involved in the shunt, huge amount of people involved in the shunt. Just the other day, got an email from McLaren Applied, got an email from Haas saying, we need to make sure that is this, and this going to be all right? And I'm like saying, after that shunt, I wouldn't even bother testing it. But, they're so up against it in terms of cost and trying to recoup some of the losses during the accidents. You've got to make sure the stuff's fit for good racing purposes. But yeah, you get that all the time. I mean, yes, it is your car, especially on the race team, because you've put it together. You've put your blood, sweat and tears, you put everything you possibly could into it, in setting it up, and that's what you're there to do. And then of course it hits the buzzers. Firstly, you obviously think, have I done something wrong? Have I not put done a nut up, or have I not? All this sort of thing starts going through your head. Will they find an issue with something that I've done or a corner that I've worked on? So it's an interesting point. But yeah.
You spoke a little bit about Red Bull, and let's go there now, because to me, and I think in retrospect, it's quite fantastically brilliant. Maybe not so much what happened at the end of last year, but quite fantastically brilliant for you being there at the birth of Red Bull Racing and just departing Mercedes ahead of what happened at the end of last year. But of course, this is the first time that an energy drink had become a team. You've come from a name of Formula One in Stewart to a brand with, yes, Ford and Jaguar, and then Red Bull. What was it like? What was that whole shift like? Because you said the shift from Stewart to Ford wasn't that great, but you've got Dietrich and all the players involved with trying to set this up, and Christian, of course, as well. What was the attitude? Because obviously DC was there as well, so they've got him out of a pretty poorly performing McLaren into this Red Bull. It must have been pretty electric compared to the first change in teams that you'd gone through.
I mean, all we could think about is there's going to be some serious Red Bull parties. And of course there was, there was. What did we think? I think it's a fizzy drink team. We still call it the fizzy drink team, even though they're actually a very powerful engineering company now. The fizzy drinks team was good. It was great, actually. I mean, there was this departure from Ford, which I don't think any of us really were fussed about, to be honest. And we all knew how Dietrich's match sits and the whole program came along. I mean, you've seen Red Bull in Formula One for 15 years before that on the Sauber. And of course you could see Red Bull in Formula 3 and Formula 3000 and bringing all these teams, so we were pretty excited about this whole, I think we were so excited. We painted the car to look like a can and they got, the marketing team got an absolute roasting for it from Red Bull, absolutely roasted. They said, there's no way our car's going to look like a can of fizzy drink. And they did this whole silver and blue thing, right? All the way down. It looked. But anyway, you'll see it. I think it's the Jaguar R5 that they painted up as it. But yeah, anyway, it didn't end up looking like that at all. Obviously, it looks like it does now, and they've maintained that. The dark blue and the stuff. But yeah, no, we were really happy about all of this. I think. I think we sort of, we thought that we were worth saving, which was a nice thing to have that feeling about, because at the time, lots of F1 teams like Arrows had fallen away and never regained. Yeah. So clearly there was something here worth saving. And also, like you say, bringing a top flight driver on, or someone with experience to help us out or help us build. And DC was exactly that. He was there. He knew he wasn't competing for races, but he was there to help us with the direction. And we got some great people on board. Some really good engineers, and really good aero people, Stefano Sordo and people like that. And of course then Christian came along later on. Young, vibrant. He had a really good intent, and he had a really good vision, and he had the money behind him to bring people on like Adrian Newey, which I never got to see actually. So I left pretty much. So I didn't stay around much.
Yes.
Due to the transition, a lot of us started to look elsewhere because of what happened to Arrows. A lot of us did start to move elsewhere, and of course we didn't have all the rumor mill as easy as we do now with what's happening with teams, because the social media side of things just wasn't about. But I'd started looking the direction of Renault. Of course, they were pretty happening team at the time, and they offered me a great position at Renault, so I jumped. I went to Renault F1 pretty much early 2005.
You did what Webber should have done. Can I just say, Webber should have followed you in that same decision in 2005.
Yeah, and that was great. Yeah, that was great. You'd come into this team that was well structured. They had some great people. There's some really great Pat Simmons.
What's Flavio like?
Flavio, what an absolute legend. Just his presence. Flavio's presence was. It was always like you knew someone had walked into the garage. Okay, he was larger than he was an F1 character at the time, right? He was. I don't think even Toto would probably come close to him as he was back then. I think the only people that would probably come close to him were Max Mosley and Bernie. Then you had Flavio running up the rear. So I think to have someone like Flavio in your team, you were, and of course, obviously we had Fernando, and we had this great. So there wasn't, the competition with Red Bull wasn't just on the track; it was off the track with creating all these new and wonderful drivers. And of course, one of our new and wonderful drivers at the time was Fernando. I mean, Red Bull had Christian Clean, and they never really made it. And, it was only really when Vettel came along that they'd started to see the fruits of their labor, because, Antonio, Vitantonio Liuzzi and all those guys, Scott Speed and stuff like that, they none of them made it through that. Whereas Flavio, and probably the might of various organisations behind him would nurture these drivers, clearly taking 95% of their salary at the same time. But, would get these guys though in front of the team managers, which just happened to be himself, of course. But clearly saw talent, and and credit where credit's due, and so it's the same for Helmut Marko and Christian Clean. You got to bruise a few apples before you find a sweet spot.
So Renault, this is 2005. This is the R25, that peak Fernando Alonso, the stunning team spirit livery that we saw him drive around Abu Dhabi a couple of years ago ahead of his return to now Alpine. Goodness, it was good to hear that motor spinning up again, at least through the television.
And it was such an easy car to work on. So easy to work on. Coming from where I've come from, and then working on the Alpha, because I was full-time trackside at Renault, so I was fully trackside. It was such an easy car to work on and so brutally fast. And Giancarlo would bring the car back in half a decent state, whereas Fernando would wring that car's neck and it would come back knackered, but brutally fast. I think China 2005, we wrapped up to 20,000 RPM and did 1,000 horsepower, and this thing just flew. I think it was managed Japan, actually. It was Japan for the sponsors,
right?
For the, and I think we did around the outside of Schumacher at 130R with 1,000 horsepower and 20,000 RPM. It was a hell of a car, great car.
Yeah, well,
and then 2006, mate. Honestly, in 2006. So we went down to a V8. we were testing the first test we did at Valencia, and it was January. It was pretty much straight after Christmas, and he got out the car after doing like 3 laps, so an out lap, a quick lap, and an in lap. And he got out the car, and before he unplugged his radio, he goes, "Yeah, we'll win the championship with that again."
That early.
Wow.
And he said that to everyone on the road. Yeah.
Wow.
And was it hard for you to believe him, or are you the kind of person that, you're waiting for the driver and the car to cross the finish line at the race that counts for the championship to win? Or is it you can feel it as well from an engineering side where you can say, yeah, this is pretty special?
Well, you can feel it, but you can also be shown it. Every race debrief, you can see the separation with the other teams and the other cars. So, and you can actually almost see that at the first test, right? First two tests, unless you're going to bring a massive upgrade. Where you're like, for example, this year, where Mercedes are like 7 tenths behind. They said, yeah, but we're going to bring 7 tenths to Australia. Well, you're not going to need that. You're going to need 13 tenths.
Yeah,
you are, because everyone else would have also bumped up as well. So it's a case of keeping on top of that gap, and you can see that fairly early on. In 2006, we could see that fairly early on, and Ferrari was obviously there, and the Williams was there as well, and you could see that gap, and it was it was a comfortable place to be, but you couldn't lift your foot off the throttle. Right? You couldn't not. You had to keep it on, like we did do at Mercedes all the time.
What was it like? Sorry, no, go on.
No, it just makes and breaks people sometimes. There's certain pressures in this sport, and if you are making it and you make it well, you've got to keep the pressure on. If you're not, then the pressure's to try and catch up. So there's never a happy medium at all in Formula 1.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because what is it like traveling around the world with that kind of pressure? From the engineering side, you mentioned earlier that, if a car gets punted into the wall, and you can see it on the mechanics' faces on the broadcast, and Haas is the most recent example. Mick's engineers were disappointed and hopeful that he was okay. Of course, he was out of the car a little later than we probably would have hoped. But that's the pressure, not only are you disappearing between different time zones and traveling long distances and having to put things together, but individually, as you start getting up the ranks in these Formula One teams, how is that like to handle that kind of pressure?
It's incredibly hard. It really is incredibly hard. You have such a short space to rectify something. I mean, look, after Renault and back, I think after Renault, moving back into Mercedes, I was pretty much factory based, and I think the pressure to deliver something to the race team that they could race. There's different tiers. Our customers are the race team, right? The customers of the race team are the drivers and the fans, right? The entertainment and the sponsors. But so we've got, back at the factory, we've got quite a lot of pressure building on to us to ensure that we've got the upgrade for the next race, that we're going in the right direction with setup. So are we doing the 7 poster and the driver in the loop and the simulators? Are we doing everything right there? Are we going in the right direction? Are we able to, you hear a lot about, well, we're not too sure if we've gone in the right direction on setup, right? You hear a lot of that. You'll hear loads of that from the Mercedes boys. Because to go in the wrong direction and keep going down that path, you can get lost. You can really get lost, and the car can be incredibly slow. And you're not working the tires as well as they should be worked. But so we need back at the factory to give a confidence level to the guys at the track to ensure that they're going to go in the right direction with setup. So our tools, our equipment, our knowledge, our experience, all needs to come together. And that's from a mechanical, from an aero perspective, from an electronics perspective, from a strategic perspective. And we've got to feed all that in together. And we talked about silos before. You can't silo those independent departments. They all had to be as one. And once you get that beautiful parity as being as one, you get the dominance that Mercedes had, with everything. So the pressure is huge to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And I was sort of, the head of testing and development. So my job was essentially to, deliver lap time. Whereas, you look on the balance sheet of any company, their bottom line is profit, right? Cash and profit are the big things. Mm-hmm. In Formula One, it's lap time, right? It's delivering reduction in lap time. So it's a lot of pressure, mate. It's a lot of pressure. And, it's a pressure that, to be honest, took me out of Mercedes. After doing it for 20 years, I don't mind telling, people that, it was ultimately the pressure that took me out of Mercedes.
Certainly can only imagine.
How do you deal with it for 7 or 8 years and then decide you've had enough? Because you obviously get used to working in those environments, and the teams that are around you and the people around you must give you a hell of a lot of confidence to do what you do as well. They empowered you, go out and drop those lap times. But what was the breaking point? What was the thing that said, we're done?
I think, this whole cost cap thing hit, or would have hit Mercedes hard, and maybe you're seeing that now. And there was definitely an imbalance of what we were trying to achieve within Mercedes, which meant you had to work basically twice as hard to maintain that level of pressure. And my own personal position was, am I going to be able to keep up my living standards, my job enjoyment, the pressure of actually just trying to deliver to myself, right, to my own standards. I always said to myself, if I'm not delivering to my own standards, then I'm going to be thinking about looking elsewhere. But the pressure was huge. The pressure to maintain we always talk about, everyone's talking about sustainability, and mental health is as much as whatever you do, you've got to be able to sustain it. And if you can't sustain it, you've got to have a word with yourself, take a step back and see what you can do. But the pressure is huge in Formula One. But then again, the support is there, and it's up to you if you choose to use it or not to. It's a big family, and they do help, and they do understand when you do have to step back and maybe, pass the reins on. This is how it works in Formula One. The younger guys come through and they have different ideas and better ideas, and it takes a level of attrition for Formula One to move on, like everything. So that was quite as simple as that.
And what would be happening in that organisation right now as we speak, having done 2 races, going to Melbourne and being significantly off the pace, which we haven't seen for probably the better part of a decade now?
Well, I'll tell you what they'll be doing. There's something which, a lot of people will disagree with me, but after 8 years of dominance, you would have had, say 8 years ago, you'd have had a graduate engineer come in, right? And in 8 years' time, he'd have worked his way up through the ranks, and he would be a junior engineer, and then he'd be a senior engineer, and now he'd be a head of department. So he's now the head of department, never knowing what it's like to lose, right? So what happens psychologically, or or resourcefully, or what happens when you're losing? And I tell you what they'll be doing right now is trying to work that out. That they are, for me, I imagine they're trying to figure out, and they will be brilliant at this. They will be absolutely brilliant at this, because when there's something not quite right, and they have to sort of reevaluate because they've approached something that they've never felt or seen before. And you can see this by the way that Mercedes went from rule change to rule change, right? And it was very, very different for them, and they adapted. And what you're seeing now is maybe a group of young engineers that have never really known what it's like to lose. Oh, what do we do? What do we do now? I can imagine there's 1,000 people there. Let's say maybe 40, 50% of the team have always won, right? I think that's probably right there. So they'll just have to learn to adapt, and they will do it super fast, and they'll do it to the letter. And this is where the pressure does does start to build up in some people. But they will do it, and they'll do it well, and you'll see that. They won't be. They won't. I mean, they've got some issues with regards to porpoising in the aero, but my God, they'll quickly turn it around.
We'll come back to Mercedes because I think we've got some specific questions about that a little later on. I just want to get your thoughts though on 2009 in Renault. Fresh-faced Romain Grosjean comes into the car. What was he like to work with? Because obviously I think the world of Formula One and now racing, especially in the US, love Romain. Yeah,
Romain was great. He was he was our test driver for many years before that, right? So I think he came along about 2007, 2008. And he was doing GP2. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting for Romain. I think Flavio almost plucked him out of GP2 too early. And I think that's true because after 2009, I think he went back to GP2. And then he won the championship. And then we saw him come back into F1. So I think there was a case of, he was definitely hungry, and he was definitely a talented, a real talent, a serious talent. But I think he just needed to do a few more laps in a GP2 car first, and trying to, he was costly. I think there was a few shunts. There was a good few shunts. But as a test driver, he was brilliant. He was really, really good. But yeah, there was a few crashes involved. I think 2009. Yeah, so that was So he replaced Nelson PK, I think. Yeah, because 2008 is when they had the very calculated ordeal in Singapore.
Yes,
but 2009
calculated ordeal.
Yeah,
that's how funny Ferrari would put it, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, that was a weird one actually, and I don't mind telling you about this. I was actually at Spa 2009, and I was a guest engineer, so I wasn't racing at the time. I was on the test team, and I don't know, gone out to have a chat. Take a whiz. I don't know what I'd done, but I came back into the garage and I was looking for the chief mechanic, and all the mechanics were there working on the cars, and I was looking for Siebes, Paul Seeby. Paul Seeby, interestingly, is the guy on flames in the iconic picture of the Benetton fire. On
really?
Really? Car, yeah. So you see the like this turn-in picture of this guy, and he's got his goggles on, right? That's Paul Seeby. So he's the chief mechanic. Great bloke.
Wow.
So I walked through the garage and I was looking for Paul Seeby, and I was like, where is he? I was looking around, I couldn't find him. Sort of, where's? I thought, well, I'll look for the engineers. And couldn't find the engineers. So I went into the truck because it was Spa. We had the trucks. We had all the engineering trucks. And I went into it was like a ghost town. Now, normally you'd have Pat Simmons probably having a bit of a snooze in the corner. No, not at all. Normally you'd find Pat Simmons and you'd find everyone there. And I just sort of said, there's no one here at all. And I went into the garage and said, there's no one. It's just us lot. It's just the mechanics and the electronics boys. And, there's got to be someone. So we all had a bit of a look around and see what was going on. No engineers at all. And then, that's when we found out they'd been summoned to the to race control to speak with the FIA because at that time, I think Nelson had just blown the whistle on what happened. So there was an investigation. I think they pulled everyone in at the same time to stop any sort of, cross correlation on. But that was interesting. Yeah, that was interesting. But going back to Romain, he was a solid driver, mate. I mean, I think there's mutterings of, race winning performance. And I think when you saw him go back to Lotus, he was definitely a changed man. Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Give him the right tools. I want to talk now about your next team, because you sort of seem to have ascended to a championship winning team. And then, of course, like anyone, Renault had their struggles after 5 and 6. But you went towards the back of the grid with Marussia, which would have been obviously very interesting and some very obvious noticeable changes, but I'm more curious as to the subtle changes. So from your end and where you came from a championship winning team, going back towards the back, what was it like? What was the attitude difference between those two organisations?
Right. Firstly, there was no subtle changes. I mean, you've gone from a manufacturer team to this. No word of a lie. This is exactly how it was. The test team had all been disbanded in 2009. I think I'd been put on the show car, and that was rubbish. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be trackside and racing. Anyway, the chief engineer left, and we sort of said, where are you going? He goes, well, there's rumours that there's going to be a new team, and I want to try and get first in the queue. And I said, right, okay, I'm going to have some of that. And long story short, I ended up in front of Johnny Booth and Graham Loudon and Dave O'Neill. And this was Manor Grand Prix, which became Virgin. And Virgin Racing, we literally sat around, there was 11 of us, Rich Lane, who's an engineer, Mark Hutchison, Dave Greenwood, and a couple of other names that are still around to this day, with blank pieces of paper, 11 of us saying, right, what do we need? We need to build an F1 team. What do we need? We literally had,
with a budget, nothing. Of course.
we had to put together a budget. Basically, that's what it was. But at the same time, we had to think, well, what do we need? What have we got? What do we need? And we're sat in an old F3 building. And F3 is vastly different to F1 in terms of, it's like going from a 50 to a 1200 on a motorbike. There's just no gap. There's no gap big enough to explain. But and we're sat in this F3 team all around a table thinking, right, what do we need? What do we do? And I think we ended up going down to Bicester, and we met with Mark Hurd and Nick Worth, and these were the people that were going to help us design this
car, yeah.
There's a level of cynicism when you're looking back at it.
Just call it a car. Jesus Christ. Many sleepless nights and that thing. I think the designer of that car, I think he's got half a dozen cars in the top 10 worst F1 design cars in the world.
Good.
What a piece of shit. So they had this amazing idea not to use a wind tunnel. And Nick, if you're listening to this, then that clearly wasn't an amazing idea. So anyway, we sat around the table. We came up with what we needed. There was some great people there. Joe Burkett, and we designed all the electronics. We got in touch with McLaren Applied, and we did the deal to get all the electronics on the car. And Joe and he did the garage, I did the car, electronics and architecture, and another guy called Gordon Pocock. And we just basically did what we had to do within 7 months to get the car on the grid in Australia. And we didn't get it on the grid in Australia. We actually started from the pit lane, I think I remember. Along with two other teams, one of which sort of fell away. Three other teams, one of which fell away. And the other one was HRT and Lotus Racing. And Christ, I mean, that was absolutely something I will never, ever forget. Building that car. We did, I think Bahrain test, we did a 60-hour day. There's three of us that did a 60-hour day. We were sleeping in tire blankets behind the racks, right? We were sleeping in tire blankets. We were sleeping on the truck. Next thing you know, the FIA bring in a curfew because they didn't see people passing out of the barriers, and that's because of Virgin and Lotus Racing.
Wow.
Cosworth oil seals would be peeing out everywhere, and it's just it was a great concept. It was a really great concept, but I think the biggest problem there was lots of problems with the Virgin car, but there was many reasons why we didn't complete a race, because Nick didn't make the car tank big enough, but we had some serious hydraulics problems. I'll tell you a story. I was in my garden.
Didn't make the tank.
I was in my garden and I get this call, Rich. Oh, hello, Nick. It was Nick Worth. How's it going? He goes, yeah, good. I said, what's up? And he said, well, we got a bit of a problem. So, what's that, mate? He says, well, we need to make the tank bigger in the car. I said, well, what are you going to do that? You're going to have to just split the car off. And yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take the back bulkhead off and we're going to shim 100 mil of car. We're going to extend the car, right? We're going to call it the limo. Oh, well, but then he said to me, he says, but what about the loom? I said, well, what about the loom? He goes, what can you do there? He goes, and I said to him, hold on a minute, mate. Let me see if my magic loom extenders are working, shall I? And
just cut it, put some connectors on, and see how you go.
I said, mate, no, we're going to have to make a whole new chassis, a whole new chassis loom, a whole new chassis. But
wow,
yeah, and it's almost like starting again. That's heartbreaking, but
wow,
needs must. And whoever miscalculated that,
yeah,
I don't even want to know.
Sounds like an episode of our podcast.
But this is but this is all the stuff in the background that people don't realise. You know, you're in your garden, you get a call from Nick Worth, I need to make the car bigger. Oh shit! Phone down. Yeah, so that was good fun. But you know, these are the challenges we had. We had loads of hydraulics problems. We had loads of aero problems. The car balance was not good. The reliability, electronics and systems, because I was doing that at the time, was perfect. I mean, going back to McLaren Applied and McLaren electronic systems at the time, it was the only thing that we could sort of count on if we weren't dragging it on the ground because we'd hit the barriers or, I mean, I can even remember an ECU being dragged along the ground and wearing a hole through it and coming back and still working, bulletproof.
Wow.
Yeah, it's bonkers. But that whole year, I mean, it was a short year because, I finished in China at Marussia in the second year in 2011. And that was it for me. That was something I'm glad I did. And I met some amazing people and we got stuck in China because of the ash cloud and everything else. And there was just so many different aspects to that year. I think there was an uprising in Bahrain as well. So there was all this worry and stuff going on with the Arab Spring. And but, it was a challenging couple of years and sort of, certainly makes you the person you are today.
Well, it certainly builds that adversity, doesn't it? Because you have to be stronger against that, which probably lent it very well to Mercedes joining the very beginning of the turbo hybrid era.
Yeah, because you had this team of people who literally from the Honda days had everything handed to them. This team had all the fantastic machinery, fully calibrated equipment, 7-post rigs, simulators, wind tunnels. I mean, from Virgin, we had sandbags. We were measuring wing deflection using sandbags, and we were sat outside or dead weights. Yeah, you go into Mercedes and you put this front wing on this rig, and these hydraulic actuators come down and they settle it, and then they go up again, and they, it's all computer controlled and all controlled beautifully, and and there's us like lugging sandbags on the top of wings, measuring it with a ruler or your eye, that'll pass, shit, send it. We're on the stories of being on the bridge at the race. Stories being on the, when you go to the bridge and the scrutineering bridge, they have this sort of, these gadgets that fit on the car to make sure you're within the box. And there's me and the Dagman Steve, shaving bits off the car to make it fit.
Oh, good.
And you come out of there and you see all the other cars lined up, ready to go into the bridge, and these cars are beautiful. And I remember seeing the Mercedes, just everything fit perfectly, and we call it the F1 mosquito. When you heard the grinders coming out in the middle of the night, you're grinding away stuff to make it fit, and all the other teams have got the lights off and down the bar. So what it's like on both sides of the fence. You're at the back of the grid. You're at the budget end. You're doing whatever it takes to survive. And then all of a sudden you come right to the very front of the grid and you start to realize not a lot of many people in that team have had that experience. So that's an interesting thing where you have to not always really think for yourself, because usually there's a process or a person doing it for you. And that can be a little bit frustrating, but at the same time, you just got to adapt. And the great thing about people who work in F1, they do adapt very quickly.
It sort of seems like that, doesn't it, with Haas at the moment? They've come from having a woeful couple of years, to use a recent example. And now suddenly, Kevin, after not even training to be in a Formula One car, comes in, puts it at P5 first race back. And yeah, they've had a couple of issues in the previous race, but they're certainly faster than the McLaren this year. And we never thought we'd be saying that, even 6 months ago, even probably 6 weeks ago. So is it maybe more interesting from a team point of view and what Gunter's leading now in terms of this attitude where he's got more people that know how good it tastes being towards this front end and that they're going to work harder to stay there?
Yeah, I think this is the first year they were really allowed to do a lot of their own aero on that car, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that power unit is tremendous, right? We're talking some serious power over the Mercedes. You can see all the Ferrari engine cars at the top and all the Mercedes engines at the bottom. So there's a huge disparity there, and that means that on the super fast long straights, the power circuits, you are going to see the Haas up there. But I think from an aerodynamic perspective, we've yet to see whether or not what they've put in place is going to complement that power unit, right? So where Haas is a good little solid team, I think it's the same team, but they've now got the drive to get them out. And it's the same as what Williams were, if you've got a good power unit behind you and a good team of people to combine that with some good aero, I think you're onto a bit of a winner. And I'm fingers crossed that is the thing for Haas. Do the drivers have an influence? It'd be interesting to put Romain back in there. Definitely. I think he would have got a top 5 as well. I really do.
Yeah.
And I said at the start of the year after the first test, Ferrari gave up 2 years ago and worked on their powertrain and aero, and Haas did the same and just had to save face for a couple of years. But I think Gene is spending a lot of money. He's put a lot more money into the company of his own money, despite the recent problems with sponsors. It just means that he's just going to have to foot the bill himself for a little bit longer. But if the results prove good for him, then it's a good, solid investment. Because the equivalent advertising budget with Netflix and media like this is it's huge, absolutely huge. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think Mercedes equivalent advertising budget was something in the order of $3 billion US. That's what they would have to spend to get the coverage that they get. So, yeah,
it's a very interesting. Yeah, it's a very interesting time looking at them. But I want to talk a little bit about Mercedes before we then talk about, of course, McLaren Applied and then the 2022 car. For you, obviously, favorite moments would probably be winning world championships, but to see the ascension of that team and putting it all together in 2014 must have been pretty special as well. As you said, you've got experience from every side of the fence, including sleeping in tire blankets and what 60-hour days look like. And of course now, getting it right. What was it like working with Toto? Because it seems that the culture there is very absolutely the winning is the most important thing. I think he signed off Drive to Survive in the latest season with everyone has a targets on their back for 2022. Did you feel that sort of trickle down to the R&D space as well? And would the juniors and graduates feel the same?
Yeah, I think everyone at Mercedes we're actually treated on the same footing, in terms of their empowerment. They were all empowered, and this was the thing that that really started to change in 13, 14 is this level of empowerment that you were given to produce the best you possibly can be. And then they started to create an intent, right? So what was the intent? The intent was to win a world championship. And then Aldo Costa said, well, why win one world championship? Because he was allowed to speak out. He said, well, why don't we win multiple world championships? Let's make our intent that we win multiple world championships. And Toto went, yeah, that sounds good. And that was the overall company intent. So everyone knew what we had to work towards. And I've never been in a Formula One team that had an intent. Now, we all know the intent is to win races or compete, but is that really the intent of Haas? I'm hoping so. But realistically, what that intent gave us was a real level of hope that we actually think we could do this. And of course, then each department or each area had their own intent, right? You know, if you were in aero, to make the best possible, most efficient aerodynamic, you know, on-time delivery, under budget, blah, blah, blah. And with R&D, it was the same. And with mechanical design, it was the same. And with the design office or with software group or with strategy group. So we all had our own little intents. And under that intent, we had to ensure that we gave results in terms of, recorded controls and evidence, right? So we started making processes to ensure that we would end up at that intent. And then, you know, below that processes, do we have the right people to undertake those processes? Do we have the right tools to make those processes work? Well, if we don't, what do we need to buy them? And let's do, you know, and then we started to break it down. And of course, all of a sudden we came up with this, it sounds like a pyramid scheme, but it's not. Or a Ponzi scheme. It was a pyramid. And this pyramid had a level of quality to it all the way down these tiers, and all of which led to the same intent. And when you put them all together, they all led to the same intent of winning multiple world championships. Sure enough, it bloody happened. And whereas I came from quite a skeptical background, you know, listening to Aldo say, yeah, well, we're multiple world championships. I said, well, the most you'll probably win is 2, right? You'll probably win 2. So what they had to do was convince me to think differently. Yeah. Because 2 years is not good enough, you know. You know, I've been flitting around from team to team, maybe, you know, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, something like that. This was a different behavior. This was a different level of intent, and they empowered me to do what I wanted to do in R&D, and I was able to build that department up from pretty much a scrappy old Honda leftovers, and we assembled a team of people and a bunch of processes, and we delivered. We delivered every day on time. And of course, everyone else was doing that. And everyone else, and Aero were doing that, and DO were doing that. And then sure enough, everyone's doing it. So it was about intent. It was about the creation of an intent and being empowered. All right, we had a shitload of cash. Right? We had a load of money. We had a load of money, but that was rationed. We would have to go and ask for it and build a business case for it. We would have to go and ask for capital expenditure or operational expenditure, or so on and so forth. We had a brilliant chief operations in Rob, and he kept, you know, he's an MBA, and you know, he knew all about the business, and he was just such a fair guy. And of course, he worked well with Toto, and then the designers. John Owen's just a genius. I'm not too sure how he got the side pods through, but you know, he is an absolute genius. Well, I call them the Hyde pods.
Hyde pods, yes.
Hyde pods.
Yeah. But yeah, the genius that is John Owen and the team that he's built around him, deliver all the time.
Before we move on to talking about McLaren Applied and the 2022 car, I'd like to get your favorite memory from your time trackside with Formula One.
It's quite funny. I think I do have one. I was sat on the pit wall, and I was sat next to the composite technician because he was doing the timing. He was pressing the buttons on the timer as they came past, right? And he'd be pressing the buttons on the timer. And sat next to me was Nelson Piquet Sr., right? Because his son was testing in the car. And so I was sort of sat, so I think his name was Jamie. He sat there, and then Nelson was sat next to him, and I was sat next to Nelson, and then Adam Carter, who was running him, I was helping Adam, and I think the young chap at the end there turned to Nelson Piquet Sr. and said, "Oh, what are you doing here? Who are you with?" And he goes, "Oh, my son in there, Nelson Piquet Jr." And he goes, "Oh, you must be a very proud dad. You must be a very proud dad." He had no idea who this guy was. 3-time world champion sat next to him. He had no idea because he was so young. He didn't even know who these people were. And I can just remember myself and Adam Carter just breaking down, just crying on there. I mean, there are loads of little things. I guess you had to be there for that one, but there are loads. There are loads. I remember, again with Adam Carter, we called him Adam Carter the fire starter because I think he was a young engineer and he was on the radio to Fernando, and it was at Jerez, and the car was at the exit of the pit lane. And he was trying to get him a space in the traffic to go out. They were saying, "Please hold, please hold." They said, "Please hold." By this point, Fernando was out the car and running out the pit lane because the car was on fire.
Telling him no.
And there's other little things like that, like saying, all the engineers on the pit wall going, "Right, okay, we're not too sure on the weather. I'm looking at the radar at the moment. All I'm doing is looking behind me, going, it's raining, mate." You don't need the stuff like that. There's common sense and stuff going on. Johnny Booth and Richard Branson all handing us, towels and water as we ran back from the pit lane in Malaysia, and he was such a nice bloke. And Johnny Booth there helping put stickers on. There's just so much to go through in my career. I think winning the 2006 championship was great. Winning the 17 championship was great because of this massive transition in car design, huge. And the 17 car was just brutal. It was just a beast. And Lewis was. It was awesome. It was absolutely awesome. 18, they're just brutal cars and just such a joy to work with. That's such a fantastic team.
Now you're at McLaren Applied. The McLaren Applied Technologies has just recently broken away from McLaren as a racing group and the auto group. And you recently joined September last year, and you're the head of Motorsport Accounts for the business. Now, probably, and you mentioned this already, not many people would know that McLaren Applied supply a hell of a lot of stuff to the paddock of Formula One. What is the role then of McLaren Applied, and what's your current role at the business?
So McLaren Applied, they have always, since 2000, I think they tendered for it in 2005, and I think it was offered. I think 2007 was the first year of a standard ECU. Anyway, basically it came about because a load of people were cheating. People were hiding stuff within their ECUs that the FIA could not, figure out what was going on, right? You saw the starts of Fernando and Giancarlo. They were blisteringly fast starts. There was bike point learning going on. There was all sorts of trick stuff happening. And the FIA, the FIA had no idea how to handle this except for just tender for a standard ECU. And of course, McLaren Electronics or Tag Electronics were already supplying to like IndyCar And that wedge shape, I don't know if you've ever seen an ECU in a Formula One car, but there's a wedge shape, and that wedge shape was designed to fit in the keel of an Indy car, so that's why it's that shape.
Wow.
Yeah, so it became an iconic shape, so they kept it. But so they applied for it and they won the tender. And I think it was the ECU and then a few little satellite things, including the dash display and the rain light and a few and this technology that sat on the upright and took all the wheel speeds and everything into one box and then shoved it into the ECU. So they won this, and the reliability was such that it just kept on perpetuating. I mean, I don't think anyone could really. I mean, I think Morelli tried to sort of hitch up, and a few others tried to hitch up, but sure enough, the infrastructure that the teams had put into their own rigs and systems that married into the car or would replicate the car meant that if someone else won the tender, maybe they'd have to do all that as well. So it'd be a big cost option. But I think what helped McLaren Applied was just the sheer reliability and the power of this little gadget, and the fact that the FAA were quite easily or are quite easily able to interrogate such a system from a single point. So they've kept it. I mean, they won the tender again in 2020, and the new tender is one of the reasons why I'm McLaren Applied. The new tender has just happened, so we've just submitted the tender. I think it's gone to the teams for review, and then it's up to the FIA to sign that off. Fingers crossed, McLaren Applied get it. 'Cause I think we worked out a stat the other day. Nearly 1.6 million kilometers without a failure in a race.
Wow.
I couldn't tell you if there's a failure in a test or on a track somewhere, but there's been various iterations, but yeah, I mean, it's quite a beast. I think there's probably only the Zytec Formula 3000 engines that come any close to that, but so look, it's a really good package, and it comes with various, easy to use software, and most of the people in the paddock know how to use the software. And then McLaren also have a presence. McLaren Applied have a presence in the pit lane with a bunch of familiar faces that go out and support as well. So it's the full package, really. And I think with the brand of McLaren behind us and our own budget now, because we've sort of broken away from the McLaren group and become McLaren Applied, we've got our own investment. But still having this iconic brand behind us really helps us, move forward. And I'm quite proud of the fact that I'm working for these people now, because I was always a customer. And the interesting thing during the interview was that I brought that up. I've been a customer for 15 years, so it was interesting for them to sort of ask me my own opinions on what I think we need to do, not just for the tender, but for all the other stuff we supply, Formula One and IndyCar. I know what it's like on the other side of the fence. So what am I expecting? How should we run this business? And that was a very flattering thing for them to ask me. So they put me in charge of the accounts. So all the F1 teams. So the F1 teams now will come to me for any new potential developments. And then I filter that down to the engineering teams and so on and so forth. I'm like their one-stop shop. If they need anything, even if it's a sale, even I'm not in sales, but I'll know the sales team or the business development team, and I can chair certain meetings where they use a common problem. They have a common problem, or I can pass on certain successes, because the teams are very good at doing that. They do like sort of saying, look, we had a really good weekend. Thanks for your team at the tractor from helping us out. And I like to pass that on as well. So I look after all the F1 accounts, and I look after all the distributors as well. We've got a couple of distributors around the world. So I look after those guys as well to help other people in other countries. And of course, we've had a real tough couple of years with pandemic and COVID and the shortage of chips supply, the microprocessors and things like that. So that's been a real challenge to dig ourselves out with a good strategy, and we're heading in that direction. Yeah.
Well, I think it's now worth talking about the 2022 Formula One car. Campy is very excited to get your insight. Campy?
Oh, where do I start? I want to ask all the questions about what's wrong with the McLaren. We're obviously Aussies and Danny Ricciardo. We got a huge bias here. Look, I'll preface the question. Red Bull, their design philosophy's always been a massive rake.
Huge rake.
Whereas Mercedes has typically been, hey, we're going to go not as big a rate. There's also a really small one, but we're going to have a longer chassis and a longer wheelbase. What is McLaren's? First question. What's McLaren's design philosophy around making cars go fast? If you could put it in a simplistic term, like that.
You know what? I think taking my McLaren Applied hat off there, really, and only looking at it from an external perspective, because we don't really have too much to do with the race team. But I think all they wanted to do this year was sort out their aerodynamic issues. Okay, so their correlation with the wind tunnel, and I think what's happened, looking at it from the outside in, is that they have really struggled with, the new regulations around the wheels, right? So the brake cooling and the hubs and the discs and things like that. And I think it's the fronts that are causing them quite a bit of problems. I think every team's design philosophy is to ensure that they have the reduced frontal area, certainly with these new regulations, I guess their intent would be to ensure that they can expose every possible, marginal gain they can do. I don't think McLaren have done that yet. I don't think they've been able to bring an upgrade until they've sorted out their, I would say, maybe the front. They've got a bit of a problem with cooling, I think, and they've got a bit of a problem then if they do start to change the upright cooling and the brake cooling, then you start talking about front wing change, and you start talking about there's big changes that happen that impact everything going further back. So I've got a suspicion they've got an issue around the front wheels. Yeah.
And moving forward, like looking towards the future, I've been a bit of a component about F1 as a whole and as a sport. It's in a bit of a limbo area, in my opinion. And when I say that, I mean we're losing a bit of identity with the world wanting to go green technologies, cars going fully electric. We've seen what electric motorsport has looked like with a few of the categories with Extreme E and Formula E. And I'm not a fan of those things, but it seems to me that it's inevitable that Formula One has to go fully electric at some point, but I'm just a fan sitting here at home. Where do you think the future of our sport lies?
Yes, I don't think it's going to. Yeah, so I've said this before in another interview with Scarbs on YouTube, and I've said this before. I don't think it will go fully electric. I don't think this will happen, because I think what will happen is that we will find alternative, say, greener fuels, i.e. biofuels. We could even have the introduction of hydrogen technology in the next 5 years. We will maintain a level of electrification, but I can't see it going more than 50-50. I really can't. And I think that's going to be the same for 2030. When they announce the new engine rules in 2026, we still have an internal combustion engine. So I think you're looking at 50-50. You've got to also remember that, we've got to be road relevant. The majority of vehicles will not be electric in 2025 onwards. Porsche have clearly made a clear intent to maintain the combustion engine, along with I think, I'm not sure if Volkswagen Audi Group follow that thought, but Porsche have come out quite clearly and said there is still quite a lot around the internal combustion, because the efficiency is so high, over 50% efficient now in a Formula One engine. So I think it is absolutely mega when you think of a road. I don't know how I can measure an efficiency of an electric motor in terms of if you just think about everything it takes from digging the stuff out of the ground to get it into a battery and making a motor. I don't know where we'd be on that.
Yep.
But I know it's a lot harder than it is to take oil out. I know it's easier to take oil out of the ground, but I think biofuels definitely, internal combustion definitely, 50% electric. Yeah, I think that's the way we're going to go, and I think you can rest your mind, with ease. That I think that will be the way to go.
Yeah.
So they're still going to be noisy.
I still want some throwback races, maybe. Possibly get some old screaming V10s back and that travel across.
You never know. I mean, honestly,
sound that travels across the city.
Biofuels happen. If green fuels happen, but it's an interesting one. But I definitely think 50-50, and of course, to drop in, McLaren Applied. It's not just biofuels. There's efficient electric drives like silicon carbide inverters that we've got, 800 volt silicon carbide inverters, and you couple that with a 350 kilowatt motor, it still allows you to have an IC engine. It still allows you to still generate that power in a very efficient way with smaller, lighter, faster batteries, and allow you to have an IC engine at the same time. So it will, I don't think it will replace it, but I think each part of it will technically get smaller but have the same amount of power. So overall it becomes more efficient and still allows you to have an IC engine with maybe a biofuel. So yeah.
Well, Richard, I think that is a positive note to finish this episode on for all of the internal combustion fans, that it probably will continue. Mate, thank you so much for spending time with us. We'd love to catch up with you again, maybe next year after we have a full-fledged 2022 regulation season, and just to see what the guys at Mercedes end up doing. But mate, we wish you all the best with McLaren Applied. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.
Well, a massive thank you to both Richard Saxby and to McLaren Applied for arranging that chat. Richard, it was honestly an absolute pleasure to hear your stories. I can't wait to catch up with you in person soon and hear so many more of them. And if you've enjoyed this conversation with Richard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a rating or review. We've got some amazing people coming up on the show